Have you ever stopped to think about why so many communities in America still face deep inequality today? Despite decades of progress, so many people are still fighting for basic respect and fairness. The answer lies in a harsh reality. America's problem is not just economic, not just political, it is a system of racial oppression that has shaped the lives of millions. Black, brown, red, and yellow people have faced, and continue to face, discrimination simply because they are not fully accepted or wanted in this country. Imagine growing up in a society where, no matter your talents, your efforts, or your dreams, you are constantly reminded that you are less than simply because of the color of your skin. This is not just history, it is a reality that has influenced generations, limiting opportunities and shaping communities. But recognizing this truth is the first step toward change. Understanding the system allows us to see the patterns, the obstacles, and the forces working against equality. In this video, we will explore how unity and awareness can empower communities to rise above these challenges. We will uncover lessons from history, stories of resilience, and the strategies that have helped people fight back against systemic oppression. You will see why recognizing a shared struggle is not about division, it is about strength, solidarity, and the power to create a future where everyone has a fair chance. If you are ready to uncover the truths that are often overlooked, to learn from history, and to see how collective awareness can spark real change, make sure you stay with us until the end. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any future insights. Together, we can explore the realities that shape our world and discover the power of knowledge, unity, and action. In a world divided by so many lines, religion, politics, class, and even neighborhood boundaries, it is easy to feel powerless, isolated, and unsure of how to create meaningful change. Malcolm X understood this reality better than most, recognizing that the true strength of a community does not come from superficial alliances or empty slogans, but from the ability to rise above internal differences and stand united in the face of a common challenge. He often pointed out that the struggles of Black people were not limited to any one sect, political affiliation, or social status, and that the constant infighting over minor distinctions weakened the very communities that had the most to gain from solidarity. In his speeches, he painted a vivid picture of what could happen when people allowed divisions to persist. The oppressor thrived, exploiting disagreements and using small conflicts as tools to maintain control. The lesson was clear: unity was not optional. It was essential, drawing inspiration from historical examples like the Bandung Conference, where nations from Africa and Asia came together despite vast differences in religion, culture, and political ideology. Malcolm X demonstrated that unity across diversity was not only possible but transformative. At Bandung, representatives who might have been enemies in other circumstances were able to focus on what truly mattered: a shared goal of resisting exploitation and asserting their autonomy. For Black communities in America, he argued, the principle was the same. Whether one was Christian, Muslim, socialist, or capitalist, what mattered most was the recognition of a shared struggle, a common experience of oppression that demanded collective action. This unity did not require individuals to erase their identities or abandon deeply held beliefs. It required a willingness to place the community's survival and empowerment above petty disputes, to listen, to compromise, and to find strength in shared purpose. Malcolm X also warned against the dangers of fragmentation, using the metaphor of the house Negro and the field Negro to show how certain individuals, by aligning themselves with the oppressor, could weaken the efforts of the majority. He urged people to look beyond surface-level differences and recognize that real power lay in collective awareness and organized, strategic action. When communities internalize this principle, they become capable of extraordinary resilience, able to overcome the psychological and structural barriers imposed upon them by systemic inequality. He illustrated this not as an abstract concept but as a lived reality, emphasizing that the successes and failures of oppressed communities around the world offered lessons that could be applied at home. By studying these historical examples and focusing on commonalities rather than conflicts, he argued, Black communities could cultivate the kind of unity that not only protected their people in the present but laid the foundation for a more just and equitable future. Through this lens, unity becomes more than a slogan. It becomes a strategy, a principle, and a source of empowerment that transforms despair into action. Malcolm X's call to set aside divisions resonates as an enduring reminder that lasting change cannot be achieved in isolation, and that the bonds forged across differences are the very instruments through which communities reclaim their agency, their dignity, and their future. In the struggle for justice and equality, Malcolm X insisted that one of the most critical truths for any oppressed community to understand is the existence of a common enemy, a force that operates beyond individual disputes and local conflicts, shaping the structures that keep people divided and disempowered. This enemy is not a single person or a specific government policy, but a system of entrenched white supremacy, an intricate network of social, political, and economic mechanisms designed to maintain the status quo by limiting opportunity, suppressing voices, and perpetuating inequality. From the schools where children are taught whose history matters, to the neighborhoods where access to resources is determined by skin color, to the workplaces and institutions where advancement is subtly constrained, this system exerts its influence everywhere, often invisible yet deeply felt. Malcolm X highlighted that recognizing this reality was not an exercise in pessimism but a necessary step toward empowerment, because only by understanding the true scope and nature of the obstacles can communities begin to organize, strategize, and act with purpose. He illustrated this point by drawing parallels with liberation movements around the world, showing how oppressed peoples from Africa to Asia, from Latin America to the Caribbean faced colonizers and exploiters who, despite differing nationalities and languages, operated under the same logic of control, domination, extraction, and cultural erasure. By identifying the common thread in these struggles, people could set aside their superficial differences and recognize the larger forces at play, focusing their energy on dismantling systems rather than fighting one another over minor distinctions. In America, this translated into a call for Black, brown, red, and yellow communities to see past the divisions created by religion, class, or political affiliation and to understand that the true challenge was not internal but external, imposed by centuries of policies, customs, and institutions that favored one group while systematically disadvantaging others. This understanding reframed internal conflicts, suggesting that the disagreements that so often splintered movements were secondary when compared to the need for a collective strategy against a deeply entrenched adversary. Malcolm X also warned that failing to recognize the common enemy left communities vulnerable to manipulation, co-optation, and distraction. He cited historical examples where leaders and institutions had been elevated by the very system meant to oppress, creating the illusion of progress while maintaining control. By contrast, when oppressed people understood the systemic nature of their challenges, they could emulate the strategies of successful global movements, leveraging unity, shared purpose, and focused action to achieve meaningful change. The concept of a common enemy was not about fostering hatred or resentment, but about cultivating clarity and alignment, ensuring that energy was directed toward dismantling injustice rather than perpetuating division. In embracing this perspective, communities could not only protect themselves from external exploitation, but also cultivate internal solidarity. building the cohesion and resilience necessary to challenge systemic oppression, reclaim agency, and chart a path toward lasting equality. In his speeches, Malcolm X often turned to history as a mirror for the present, drawing lessons from moments when oppressed peoples had risen above division to confront injustice with collective strength. And one of the most striking examples he used was the Bandung Conference of 1955. This gathering, held in Indonesia, brought together nations from Africa and Asia, each carrying the weight of colonization, exploitation, and centuries of imposed inequality, yet representing a vast spectrum of religions, languages, and political systems. Despite their differences, the nations of Bandung recognized that their individual struggles shared a common thread: the domination of Western powers, whose influence had shaped borders, economies, and societies for generations. What made Bandung remarkable, and why Malcolm has held it up as a model, was the conscious decision to exclude those very powers from the conference, creating a space where the oppressed could meet on equal footing, unburdened by the influence of their oppressors. This deliberate act of exclusion was not born of hatred, but of strategy. It allowed participants to focus entirely on common objectives, to build trust, and to forge alliances based on shared experience rather than imposed hierarchies. Malcolm X urged Black communities in America to learn from this approach, emphasizing that unity is not merely a moral ideal but a practical necessity for survival and progress. He argued that internal divisions, whether religious, political, or class-based, were minor obstacles when compared to the systemic forces of oppression that acted across every aspect of life. By looking to Bandung, communities could see a blueprint for cooperation, prioritize shared goals, recognize the common enemy, and cultivate solidarity that transcends superficial disagreements. The conference demonstrated that even when people come from diverse backgrounds, with competing ideologies and conflicting histories, they could still act decisively and cohesively when the stakes were understood and agreed upon. Furthermore, Malcolm X highlighted that the success of Bandung did not rely on military power, wealth, or technological superiority. It relied on clarity of purpose, strategic organization, and the willingness to submerge individual differences for collective gain. He suggested that these principles could be applied anywhere, including the urban neighborhoods and grassroots movements of America, where communities often struggled to present a united front. By emulating the Bandung model, people could learn to resolve conflicts internally, to negotiate disagreements in private, and to emerge publicly with a cohesive and coordinated strategy that protected the community and amplified its voice. It was a call to act with intelligence and foresight, understanding unity as both a shield and a lever, capable of magnifying influence and resisting systemic pressures. In telling this story, Malcolm X framed Bandung not just as a historical event, but as a living lesson, an example of what is possible when communities refuse to be divided by imposed labels or minor disputes, and instead focus on the transformative power of collective action in the pursuit of justice and equality. Malcolm X challenged his audience to rethink what revolution truly meant by drawing stark comparisons between global uprisings and the American civil rights movement, insisting that genuine revolutions were never gentle or symbolic but rooted in tangible demands and the willingness to confront power directly, often at great personal cost. He pointed to revolutions in history, from the American and French revolutions to the struggles in Russia, China, Algeria, and across Africa and Asia, arguing that they shared essential characteristics. They were centered on the acquisition of land or control over resources. They sought genuine independence from oppressive authorities, and they inevitably involved bloodshed as a reflection of the resistance required to overturn entrenched power structures. Malcolm X's critique of the civil rights movement in the United States stemmed from his observation that, while activists worked tirelessly to desegregate schools, lunch counters, and theaters, the movement lacked the fundamental elements of a revolution as historically defined. It was largely nonviolent, often negotiated within the confines of a system designed to maintain control, and focused on incremental, symbolic changes rather than the reclamation of land. Sovereignty, or full political and economic independence. He highlighted the irony that African Americans had bled and died abroad in wars imposed by the very government that denied them justice at home, pointing out the dissonance between risking life for foreign interests while accepting limited reforms under domestic oppression. In contrast, the revolutions he cited abroad did not seek mere accommodation. They demanded the complete reordering of power relations. The Chinese Revolution, for example, expelled colonial influences and eliminated internal collaborators, establishing a new social and political order that reflected the agency of the formerly oppressed. Similarly, in Africa, liberation movements fought not for token concessions but for control over land, resources, and self-determination, often engaging in prolonged and bloody struggles to achieve it. Malcolm X used these examples to argue that the civil rights movement's focus on integration and nonviolent protest, while morally and socially significant, failed to challenge the deeper systemic structures that continued to marginalize African Americans economically, politically, and socially. He also emphasized that revolutions required unity and clarity of purpose, qualities that were often undermined in America by internal divisions and the co-optation of leaders who had been elevated by the system rather than emerging from grassroots struggle. According to Malcolm X, the nonviolent approach of the civil rights movement inadvertently allowed external forces to dilute its potency, turning what could have been a radical challenge to entrenched power into a managed negotiation that maintained the status quo. By contrast, revolutionary movements worldwide demonstrated that decisive, coordinated, and sometimes violent action was often necessary to achieve meaningful transformation, and that the lessons from these global struggles could inform strategies for liberation at home. For Malcolm, understanding the true nature of revolution was not an endorsement of violence for its own sake, but a call to recognize that systemic change demanded more than symbolic gestures, requiring courage, cohesion, and a willingness to confront entrenched power directly in the pursuit of genuine freedom and equality. Malcolm X consistently urged his audience to examine the lessons of history with unflinching honesty, insisting that the revolutions which reshaped nations and redefined societies were forged through struggle, confrontation, and profound sacrifice, rather than the patient endurance of injustice or passive appeals to morality. He drew parallels between the American Revolution, where colonists fought violently for land and autonomy against a distant monarchy, and the French Revolution, which erupted from the pent-up frustrations of a landless populace oppressed by aristocratic privilege, showing that both movements demanded bloodshed and uncompromising commitment in order to succeed. Similarly, the Russian Revolution saw peasants rise against landlords and state forces, enduring years of conflict to dismantle centuries-old hierarchies, while the Chinese Revolution eliminated internal collaborators and colonial influences with unrelenting force, establishing a social and political order that reflected the agency of the previously oppressed. Across Africa, liberation movements fought against colonial powers with similar intensity, understanding that concessions from oppressors were rarely given voluntarily, and that meaningful independence required courage, cohesion, and the willingness to confront entrenched authority directly. In this context, Malcolm X critiqued the American civil rights movement for its reliance on peaceful suffering, highlighting the inconsistency of a system that demanded African Americans risk life and limb in foreign wars while advocating patience and nonviolence in the face of domestic oppression. He underscored that history teaches a clear pattern. Systemic change rarely comes from polite requests, moral appeals, or symbolic gestures. It emerges from organized, decisive action that challenges power structures at their core. To endure injustice passively, Mao argued, is to accept a controlled, diluted reform rather than pursuing true liberation. And he warned that those who embrace this approach risk being pacified by appearances of progress while the underlying mechanisms of oppression remain intact. He emphasized that revolution is not abstract or ceremonial, it is concrete and demanding, requiring not only personal courage but collective solidarity. The revolutions of the past succeeded because communities set aside internal disputes and focused on shared objectives, prioritizing strategic coordination over individual grievances. The Chinese, African, and Latin American revolutions, he cited, demonstrated that when the masses act with clarity of purpose, even against numerically superior and technologically advanced forces, they can reshape society, reclaim land, and redefine sovereignty. These historical examples illuminated the gap between symbolic integration campaigns in the United States and the radical transformation achieved elsewhere, showing that enduring freedom is the product of confrontation, not compromise with oppression. By weaving these lessons together, Malcolm X called on African Americans to recognize that meaningful change requires embracing the principles that underpinned revolutions worldwide: the courage to confront injustice, the commitment to collective action, and the willingness to endure sacrifice when necessary. History, he insisted, does not reward passive suffering, it favors those who rise decisively, challenge authority, and refuse to accept half measures in the pursuit of justice. In understanding these truths, communities can learn not to be distracted by superficial reforms or co-opted leaders, but to pursue liberation with the same uncompromising intensity that has defined successful revolutions throughout the world, transforming oppression into opportunity through strategic, unified action that honors both the past and the potential for a more just future. Malcolm X urged his listeners to grasp the profound difference between black nationalism and what he termed the Negro Revolution, emphasizing that one sought genuine sovereignty while the other aimed merely for acceptance within a system designed to maintain control over black people. He explained that black nationalism is rooted in the aspiration for self-determination, the reclamation of land, culture, and political authority, a commitment to creating institutions and communities that reflect the values and priorities of the oppressed, rather than seeking validation from those who have historically subjugated them. In contrast, the Negro Revolution, as he described it, focused on incremental integration, desegregating lunch counters, theaters, and public spaces without challenging the underlying structures of oppression or demanding full autonomy. While well-intentioned and morally persuasive, this approach risked confining progress to the boundaries set by the very system that perpetuated inequality, offering symbolic victories rather than the tangible control and freedom that black nationalism demanded. He illustrated this distinction through historical reflection, contrasting the House Negro and the Field Negro of slavery. The House Negro, living in relative comfort alongside the master, internalized the values and priorities of the oppressor, defending a system that maintained his privileges while others suffered, mirroring the behavior of those who advocate for superficial integration today. The Field Negro, in contrast, endured brutal labor and oppression yet maintained a vision of freedom and a willingness to challenge the status quo, embodying the spirit of revolutionary nationalism. Malcolm X argued that the majority of black people were the heirs of the Field Negro, whose strength, resilience, and desire for autonomy could become the foundation for a true national consciousness. The House Negro, whether historically or in modern contexts, represents co-optation, individuals elevated by the system to pacify the masses and moderate the urgency of revolutionary action, often serving as intermediaries who temper demands for real change. By framing the civil rights struggle within this lens, Malcolm X highlighted the limitations of seeking approval from a system structured around white supremacy, insisting that integration alone could not resolve the fundamental disparities in power, wealth, and self-determination. He pointed out that grassroots movements, spontaneous collective action, and a refusal to accept externally imposed limitations were necessary to transform communities and reclaim agency, drawing inspiration from revolutionary movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where oppressed peoples acted decisively to overthrow exploitative regimes rather than negotiate for limited concessions. Black nationalism, he insisted, was about creating a foundation for independence that would not require the permission of oppressors. Establishing economic, political, and cultural structures that could sustain freedom and prosperity on the community's own terms. Malcolm X's argument was ultimately a call to consciousness, to recognize the difference between acquiescence and autonomy, between seeking incremental approval and demanding fundamental rights. He urged his audience to identify with the vision of self-determination exemplified by field Negroes, revolutionary movements abroad, and the enduring spirit of resistance that refused to accept marginalization. Through understanding the distinction between black nationalism and the Negro Revolution, he encouraged a shift from symbolic victories to substantive liberation, challenging individuals and communities to pursue strategies that secure real power. Collective independence, and the long-term capacity to shape their own destiny without reliance on those who had historically denied them justice and equality. Malcolm X's reflections on the House Negro and Field Negro offered a stark lens through which to understand the dynamics of loyalty, oppression, and resistance within the black community, illustrating a pattern that persisted from slavery into modern society. He explained that the House Negro, living in the relative comfort of the master's home, had a vested interest in the system that allowed him privilege over his brethren. He dressed well, ate better, and enjoyed proximity to power, and in exchange, he became invested in maintaining the status quo, defending the master and acting as an intermediary to keep the larger population in check. The House Negro's worldview was shaped by the benefits of accommodation. He identified with the oppressor more than with the oppressed, adopting the language, values, and loyalties of those who controlled his environment. Malcolm X drew a direct line from this historical figure to modern equivalents. Individuals elevated by social, economic, or political structures who, intentionally or unconsciously, moderate demands for justice, discourage radical action, and promote integration over independence, thereby preserving the systemic hierarchy rather than challenging it. In contrast, the Field Negro embodied resilience, awareness, and a hunger for freedom born from lived suffering, enduring long hours of grueling labor, inadequate provisions, and frequent punishment. The Field Negro understood acutely the reality of oppression and harbored a desire not merely for comfort within the existing system, but for its transformation or complete rejection. Malcolm X argued that this majority, though subjected to the harshest conditions, retained the revolutionary potential that the House Negro lacked. Their loyalty was not to the oppressor, but to the collective pursuit of autonomy, justice, and dignity. They were willing to risk their lives and confront danger because their connection to survival, to the integrity of their communities, and to the vision of self-determination was uncompromised by proximity to privilege. This distinction, he emphasized, was crucial in evaluating leadership, community cohesion, and the pathways toward genuine empowerment. Malcolm X extended this analogy to critique modern movements and leadership within the black community, highlighting how figures who resemble the House Negro often absorb accolades, occupy positions of influence, and shape public narratives in ways that dilute revolutionary momentum. They may promote nonviolence, compromise, and symbolic integration while the larger population, the Field Negro majority, remains frustrated, unrepresented, and eager for substantive change. The lesson, he insisted, is that true progress cannot be led by those whose interests are aligned with the structures of oppression. It must emerge from the grassroots, from those whose lived experiences demand action and whose solidarity cannot be bought or pacified. Through this lens, Malcolm X's analogy becomes a narrative of awareness and empowerment, urging individuals to recognize where their loyalties lie and to cultivate a mindset aligned with collective freedom rather than personal accommodation. The story of the house and field Negro is not merely historical. It serves as a living framework to understand internalized oppression, co-opted leadership, and the enduring challenge of mobilizing a community for authentic liberation. By acknowledging these dynamics, he suggested, the oppressed can strategize, build cohesion, and harness the revolutionary potential inherent in the majority, ensuring that the pursuit of justice reflects the needs, strength, and resilience of those who have historically been denied power, rather than the limited comfort of those who have profited from submission. Throughout his speeches, Malcolm X warned that the structures of power in America had long mastered the art of control, not only through overt oppression, but through the careful cultivation of select individuals who could serve as intermediaries between the oppressors and the oppressed. He described how white institutions, recognizing the potential for unrest among black communities, deliberately elevated certain leaders who outwardly represented the interests of the people, but were, in fact, instruments of containment. These modern Uncle Toms, as he called them, were groomed and publicized, given platforms, and lauded in the media, appearing as champions of justice while subtly or sometimes overtly steering the movement in ways that mitigated its threat to the established order. The process was strategic and systematic. By providing recognition, resources, and influence to a few, the institutions effectively pacified the majority, redirecting energy that could fuel genuine change into channels that maintained stability for those in power. Malcolm X illustrated this dynamic by referencing events during the civil rights era, particularly the March on Washington, where grassroots energy and local organization were co-opted by prominent national figures who had the endorsement of white elites. What began as a potential demonstration of collective power and uncompromising demand for justice became, through strategic oversight and media framing, a highly choreographed event that emphasized symbolism over substantive disruption. Local organizers, who were risking everything in their communities, found their work overshadowed and constrained by the presence of leaders whose prominence owed more to white institutional approval than to the trust and lived experience of the masses. This manipulation, Malcolm argued, was not merely incidental but a continuation of a historical pattern. Just as house Negroes had been rewarded for loyalty and used to monitor the field Negroes during slavery, modern systems continue to leverage visibility, prestige, and social reward to create internal obstacles to authentic revolutionary action. He emphasized that the danger of these elevated leaders was not merely personal but systemic, because they could influence narratives, moderate demands, and dictate strategy in ways that diluted the potency of grassroots movements. By occupying positions of influence, they created a buffer between the majority of the people and the levers of change, ensuring that activism remained manageable and ultimately non-threatening to the established power hierarchy. This, Mao argued, was why genuine grassroots movements often had to operate independently, relying on local knowledge, shared struggle, and community solidarity rather than the guidance of those whose allegiance had been subtly shifted through privilege and institutional support. In telling this story, Malcolm X framed a critical lesson about power, leadership, and vigilance. The liberation of oppressed people requires awareness not only of external oppression but of the internal dynamics that can inhibit true progress. Recognizing the role of modern Uncle Tums is essential to ensuring that energy, sacrifice, and strategy are directed toward collective empowerment rather than being channeled into spectacles that benefit the few. The analogy bridged history and contemporary struggle, connecting the legacy of slavery, the patterns of co-opted leadership, and the need for independent, self-determined action, painting a vivid picture of the ongoing challenges faced by communities seeking justice in a world that has long sought to control them through both overt and subtle means. By understanding these mechanisms, the oppressed can safeguard their agency, cultivate authentic leaders from within, and sustain movements capable of transforming society in meaningful and lasting ways. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration into Malcolm X's observations, the story of the March on Washington stands as a striking example of how movements with immense grassroots potential can be subtly redirected to serve the interests of those in power. What began as a raw, passionate uprising of local communities, people risking everything in their streets, their neighborhoods, and their daily lives, was co-opted by influential figures and wealthy donors who sought to neutralize its revolutionary energy. The vision of change that came from the masses, fueled by genuine outrage and a desire for justice, was transformed into a carefully staged event, stripped of the radical urgency that had propelled it. Leaders who were elevated through institutional favor became the public face, mediating between the system and the people, while the broader movement's capacity to challenge entrenched power structures was muted. Malcolm X's critique highlights a timeless lesson about power dynamics. When movements are co-opted, the focus often shifts from structural transformation to performative gestures, from the pursuit of true equality to symbolic victories that placate rather than liberate. The lesson here is not merely historical, it resonates today. Genuine change requires vigilance, awareness, and commitment to grassroots organizing, ensuring that the energy, voices, and sacrifices of the people are never overshadowed by those who are more concerned with optics than outcomes. The dynamics he described remind us that leadership, no matter how charismatic or celebrated, is not inherently synonymous with revolutionary action. It must be accountable to the people it claims to represent. Reflecting on this, we are reminded that true progress demands active participation, critical thinking, and the courage to question systems that attempt to control or redirect our efforts. It encourages us to examine the institutions and individuals we place our trust in, to value the collective voice over the influence of a few, and to recognize the subtle forces that can dilute movements from within. By understanding these lessons, we are better equipped to ensure that modern efforts for justice, equality, and empowerment remain rooted in the needs, experiences, and determination of the communities themselves. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this story, to reflect on the insights of Malcolm X, and to consider the ongoing challenges of leadership, unity, and grassroots action. If this content resonated with you and deepened your understanding, please show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, so we can continue exploring powerful stories that shed light on history, leadership, and the fight for justice. Your engagement helps ensure that these lessons reach a wider audience. Inspiring thought, action, and a deeper appreciation of the forces that shape our world.